Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Kiparsky for our final session today. And the title of the lecture was, I don't even have the program here, so something about Germanic stress and some, some hidden structure, yes?
Thank you.
All right,
Thank
sorry.
you. So about 40 years ago, Morris Halle was enjoying a sabbatical, and he and I used to meet in Widener Library to discuss Indo-European Indo-European accentuation. I very much treasure the memory of those days, and I hope this little contribution will remind Morris of what we did then. I have to say that my father wrote a book about Russian accentuation and told me, don't ever work on accentuation. It'll drive you crazy. Furthermore, you'll have huge fights with all the accentologists. And he was right about at least the second prediction there, but I'm very glad that I didn't follow it, because working with Morris was very much worth it. And I want to add, as a personal note, one other reason why I chose this topic here is that the crucial evidence that I'm going to draw on comes from a dialect of Swedish spoken not very far from where I was born and raised. So I'm going to talk about the transition from the Germanic stress system to the Scandinavian pitch accent system. And we know in general that tone and pitch accent have several sources. Familiar sources, consonantal effects on neighboring vowels, voicing, aspiration, glottalization, have tonal effects which can be phonologized. Syllable structure changes, for example, Livonian or the Rhine Delta, or a few Norwegian dialects also. My talk presents a new source of pitch accent, which is just stress. And let me remind you about the basic facts of Scandinavian accent 1 and accent 2. It's a contrast which doesn't exist in monosyllables, but disyllabic and longer words distinguish between accent 1 and accent 2. Here's a kind of classic typology of the Swedish dialects. The distinction is between one-peak and two-peak dialects. Essentially, two-peak dialects have two high pitches distributed in the accent 2 words, and in the one-peak dialects, there's simply a timing difference between the high pitch. So here you can see the one-peak dialects, and here you can see the two-peak dialects in a very schematic way. This comes from some work by a German scholar, Meyer, from way back. So I'm going to be talking about the ancestors of the immediate ancestors of the two-peak dialects, from which the one-peak dialects then developed by simplification. So here's the typology. Again, we have on the one-peak dialects, which distinguish between the timing early in the stress syllable or late in the stress syllable, or in some cases the whole thing is shifted over. You have the accent 2 manifested in the post-stress syllable. And so here's kind of various flavors. And the distribution is quite complicated. This map is from Riad's work. And the thing to focus on here is that in central Sweden, you get this characteristic type of two-peak accentuation that I'm going to be talking about. Just so that you can listen to it.
Hammer, 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 hammer.
I want to convince you that this is truly a tonal contrast. There is absolutely no stress difference between these two words. It's just the location of the high pitch on the first syllable that distinguishes these. And this is essentially the case for almost all of the modern Swedish and Norwegian dialects. Now, there are two main theories of the origin of lexical tone. There's the target delay or peak delay theory, which says that words of two syllables or more get accent 2, and words which are originally monosyllabic get accent 1. And essentially, you start with one pitch accent that is delayed in longer words, and the high pitch shifts somewhat to the right, perhaps even to the second syllable. And this difference in alignment between monosyllables and disyllables is subsequently reanalyzed as a lexical tone distinction. The second view traces it back to a stress difference between what became the accent 1 and accent 2 words. So there's good reason to believe that Germanic words were parsed into Moraic trochees. Each foot has a redundant pitch accent, and subsequent reduction of secondary stress leads to reanalysis of the redundant pitch accent as a distinctive lexical tone. So the most prominent defender of this theory is Thomas Riad. And I'm going to present new evidence from hitherto unanalyzed Fenno-Swedish dialects that supports the two-stress theory by presenting essentially the intermediate stage by which the Scandinavian accents came out of Germanic stress. So in detail, the development of accent 2, according to that second theory, is this, that you have words with more than one stress foot in Germanic, which, for example, varmidom has two feet, and that each one of those feet gets a stress, and that stress, both of those stresses, have a redundant pitch accent, which is then retained after the stress is lost. The reason the stress is lost is that the quantitative basis of it goes away. The long vowels that gave you the Moraic trochee, for example, the secondary stress here, disappear, but the stress that they conditioned remained and was then retained. The stress itself then went away, but was retained as accent 2. So all of these words have, in contemporary Swedish or mainland Scandinavian Swedish accent 2, whereas words with a single stress foot in Germanic have accent 1 in continental Scandinavian. And so in the dialects that I'm going to show you, as in Germanic and Proto-Nordic, accent 2 words still have 2 or more underlying stresses. That is, these stresses didn't go away. Each of those feet in the accent 2 words is assigned a pitch accent. And so this is the original hypothesized continental Scandinavian system, which is preserved. And the dialects that preserve them are spoken about 70 miles west of Helsinki in places like Snappertuna and Tenala, and also in really in the boondocks in Sweden, in Älvdalen, known for its extremely conservative syntax as well by syntacticians. Okay? And so here's...
De var stora och fejta och starka. De där fåren om man skulle hålla dem i famnen.
So the superscripts mark the two accents. I'll give you a chance to hear it again. Accent 2, the first 3 words, accent 1, the next 2 words.
De var stora och fejta och starka. De där fåren om man skulle hålla dem i famnen.
Okay, so there is a secondary stress on the second syllable of the first 3 words. The data come from a this data actually you can hear on the web, but I'm now in possession of about 1 week's worth of a corpus of spoken text from this group of dialects, thanks to the Swedish Literature Society, which devoted a whole lot of energy in the 60s and 70s to collecting it. Fortunately, because those dialects are pretty much obsolescent or maybe even extinct today. And there's a nice analysis of them by Ebba Selenius, which I've also used.
Famnen.
So here's some pitch tracks that might show you the distinction.
Starka.
And you can see kind of the 2 peaks in the second word rather clearly. And you can see that the 2 peaks look similar, okay? So there's sort of 2 copies of the same melody.
Ullen. Spinnas.
You want to hear it again?
Ullen. Spinnas.
Okay, so I want to give you 9 arguments that we're dealing. This is that we're actually dealing with a stress difference. And argument number 1 is based on a phenomenon of Coda gemination. So in Swedish of this type, that includes standard Helsinki Swedish, voiced obstruents are geminated after sonorants in stressed position. So starka or stark both have a geminate K. Now, in this dialect, this gemination applies to both stressed syllables in accent 2 words. So you actually get 2 geminates in a word like gamlast. Okay, both the M and the S are geminated. So this shows you that you're actually dealing with 2 stresses, because there's really no reason why a pitch accent should cause lengthening of a consonant, whereas we know the phenomenon of weight to stress in these particular dialects.
Till kläder så lagar sig valman som man väver hemma.
So sentence intonation, phrase final, fall and rise, is located quite regularly on the second peak of these accent 2 words, right? But since intonation contours are normally positioned with respect to stressed syllables, this suggests that accent 2 words have 2 stresses. So here it is again.
Till kläder så lagar sig valman som man väver hemma.
Right?
På det som kallas till fårtvätta, som de gäller.
So in Central Swedish, emphasis can weaken or neutralize the contrast between accent 1 and accent 2. And in these dialects, Tenala, Snappertuna, this never happens. In fact, the contrast between accent 1 and accent 2 is enhanced by these intonational features. And it's rather, there's a tendency to reduce the difference in, to neutralize accent 2 to accent 1 in these reduced contexts. So that's another indication that we're dealing with a stress. So here's
No så skulle han nog klippas alltid.
stress out of focus, not so clear.
Så då skulle de alltid klippas.
Stress in focus, much clearer, right? Might hear it again.
Så då skulle de alltid klippas.
And this same behavior of the shift of focus accent onto the second syllable, on the second stress of accent 2 words, is found in those Älvdalen dialects and the other dialects in that part of remote Sweden, which also have preserved this archaic accent system. So the word jelok, which is this dialect's form for elak, which means evil or mean or whatever. And so when this is put in a certain context, the focus stress shifts onto the second syllable. Elak, but elokice, vai inte jelokice. Okay, this would not happen if this was an unstressed syllable, but it happens in accent 2 words when you're dealing with a stressed syllable.
Och då skulle det ökas då, vet du.
Same thing in very closely related dialect of central Sweden, ökasto. So normal would be ökas, but skulle ökasto, right?
Tarkka.
Okay, so argument 4, the realization of accent 2 is essentially 2 copies of accent 1. Each stress is assigned a copy of the accent 1 melody. So you can see it in the pitch track, and this makes a lot of sense if we just assume that we have two stresses, and each of those stresses gets assigned a copy of its melody. In these 2-stress dialects, there's a completely categorical generalization that all compounds have accent 2. That's not the case for for many of the Swedish dialects that don't have this system anymore, the ones that operate with pure pitch, because many of those just have a single pitch contour that's distributed over both parts of the compound. Okay? But if you're dealing with a stress system, then it's very natural that both parts of the compound should keep their own stress. Since each member of a compound must minimally contain a foot, and so then both must be stressed, and that means on this analysis that there's 2 stresses there, and each one of those gets a pitch accent. Therefore, they must have accent 2.
Sen vävde man halvylleklänningar åt kvinnfolk och åt drängarna så vävdes det nog halvyllekläder med.
Okay, so here you can hear half wool, right? Halvylle.
Sen vävde man halvylleklänningar åt kvinnfolk och åt drängarna.
You can hear actually that the second of these stresses is more prominent in compounds. That's characteristic of this particular dialect, not necessarily all of them. It's the last one that usually carries the primary stress in compounds.
Drängarna så vävdes det nog halvyllekläder med.
So in fact, the accentuation of compounds as far as I can tell, is identical to the accentuation of non-compound accent to words, right? And that follows because the compounds naturally, inherently have two accents, and the accent to words have two accents as a lexical property because they once had 2 feet in the original language.
Man skulle fara och simma om somrarna.
So in trisyllables, it's rather interesting. It's the second syllable that's prominent. So that makes a lot of sense since we have 2 feet, right? And some rana, and the peak of the second foot, rana, gets the pitch accent. That's very different from what you get in Stockholm, where you get, unfortunately, the association lines dropped out here, where the high pitch of the two, this is Stockholm would be a two-peak dialect, but without the stress, without the second stress, there the melody is distributed in a completely different way. So here you get really each foot, some rana, getting a separate pitch accent. Central Swedish has just 1 foot per word, but 2 pitch accents, and you get quite a large variety of different distributions of accents in these longer accent to words. Next comes balanced stress. That's a very interesting phenomenon. These are words that have a short stress syllable originally and still in these dialects. So words like bara, fara, sama, for example, were always single bimoraic feet, possibly with resolution if they ended in an additional consonant. Now, in the conventional treatment of these dialects, they are classed as accent to words. And by this theory, they shouldn't, because they only had 1 foot, right? But you just have to listen to them, and you can see it's an entirely different kind of accent too. The first syllable is actually the locus of intonation and emphasis, and there's just a single pitch contour over both syllables. So it's actually identical to that second accent in som rana. Okay, bara is exactly like som rana. You can so what we get in those words is just the accent that's assigned to a bimoraic dissyllable that is to a single foot. So
Vad är sandlångs med väggarna?
you can compare vegana,
Just som en liten hagga.
and this is identical to the accent that you would get in bara and so forth.
Nå, så blev de ju mycket värre till sig ut som de hade varit förut. Med samma sen igen.
So myky and vari and sama have an accent that's indistinguishable from the second part of samrana, vegana, and so forth.
Men kanske de skakar bort den sen igen när de torkar. Ifrån den där taran deras.
What do I have here?
Taran. Taran, 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 taran.
I forgot that I trying to help you here.
Till bättre kläder.
Okay, so monomoraic CVC words plus acclitic get accent 1, of course, as in all these Scandinavian dialects. That's because the word minus the clitic definite article or the epenthetic vowel forms a lexical domain which gets assigned a single accent, a single foot. So we know why that has to be the case. Next, anacrusis, and this is a very puzzling phenomenon. So anacrusis, that means when you have an extra light syllable, an unstressed syllable before the main stress. Then, in these dialects, you get accent 1. Without that extra unstressed syllable, you get accent 2. That's extremely mysterious, because why, if this were a pitch system, why would putting an unstressed syllable before the primary stress give you a change in pitch? There's no reason to it. But if you have a understanding of this as a rhythmic phenomenon, then it makes a lot of sense, because we know that anacrusis aggravates stress clash, and the change from accent 2 to accent 1 is just your expected defooting. So, for example, 2, accent 2, lasta, accent 1, belasta. Okay, the prefixing the be causes the accent shift. Well, this is very similar to what we can observe, let's say, in English. We can have artistic, Buddhistic, monistic, so we can take a stressed monosyllable and put an inherently stressed suffix after it, artistic, but we can't easily at least say defeatistic, careeristic, extremistic, volunteeristic, and so forth. So if we put an extra unstressed syllable before the stressed syllable, the clash becomes aggravated. In this case, the morphology tells us don't do it, please. In the Swedish case, the phonologist says, I'm going to fix this by deaccenting the first syllable, and that's manifested then as a change in pitch. Or take the monosyllable rule in English verse. It's just a metrical instance of the same fact. Pluck the keen teeth from the fierce tiger's jaw is good, but pluck immense teeth from enraged tiger's jaws is not good. So when we put this extra unstressed syllable within the same word, we get a complication, a stress clash becomes aggravated, and it pushes the line into the territory of unmetrical verse. So the historical development involves, on this hypothesis, 2 stressed dialects undergoing defooting, becoming 2 peak dialects, that is the Tenala Snappertuna type of Fenno-Swedish dialect becomes a 2 peak dialect of the Stockholm type, then accent is simplified, and you get the 1 peak dialects, for example, of southern Sweden, and then you get the 1 accent dialects in which the 2 accents just merge. There's a loss of this pitch accent contrast. This is again what I had at the beginning, just to remind you of the posited historical account. And we now have to ask, why was stress phonologized as lexical tone? One plausible story is this, that stress on word final light syllables, that is after the shortening of the originally long syllables that got their own foot and therefore had a pitch accent redundantly, the stress that remained was poorly cued, right? Stress on a short syllable is not so perceptible, so it's enhanced by high pitch. So you, instead of tvetta, you got tvetta with an extra high pitch to remind you of the contrast. And so if we now think about how this works historically, then by hypothesis, enhancement features are introduced in the lexical phonology. That is, we get a contrast introduced in the phonology so that when the de-stressing occurs by hypothesis, always sound changes are introduced in the post-lexical phonology, the lexical contrast remains. So that's sort of the story of phonologization that comes out of Stradel OT. And the idea would be that de-stressing begins in phrasal context, favored in stress-clash context, and where the stress doesn't carry sentence intonation. When de-stressing is generalized across the board, then you have a lexically distinctive tone, which is what you have in central Sweden.
Och har han på alla vis brutna.
So that implies that all two-stress dialects retain monomoreic feet. Brutna, brutna, and that's exactly what we find. So this is true for Älvdalen, for Tenala, and so forth. So this says that there's a precondition for the phonologization of the old bimoreic foot structure, which is that you retain the stress even after shortening. Why would you retain stress after shortening? Why didn't you just get rid of it? Well, this is where you can argue that, I'm going to skip some stuff, that the former distribution of these two-tone systems coincides with the former distribution of Finnish and Lappish, or Saami speakers. And it was those languages that not only had, but reveled in stressed short syllables. Okay? So the idea is there's a substratum effect. These bilingual speakers, perhaps, knew how to pronounce stress on short syllables. They could say things like bara or tvetta, and this led to the retention of the precursor of the two-stress systems of Nyland. So they were co-territorial with these relevant dialects. So this is the Saami population, its historical distribution. And of course, down here, we get a Finnish population. Both Finnish and Saami have the same relevant distribution of accented short syllables. This is the idea then. Saami and Finnish themselves have no pitch accents, of course, but contact with them might have contributed to retaining the stress precursors of pitch accent in Scandinavia. Thank you.
That's really very interesting, Paul, and it makes me think about what happened in Middle English from Old English, where, of course, the situation was that the stress was not contained on the final syllables, which then opened the way for English to be stressed by Latinate stress. And I suspect that couldn't have happened in the situation you described, because Saami and Finnish was providing a block for that kind of amalgamation of two different stress systems. So it's very interesting. Thank you.
Hi, Christine UMass Amherst. This is kind of a clarification question. I really enjoyed hearing your audio samples, and one thing I noticed about them was that a lot of the accent 2 words you had were in a kind of utterance or sentence final position. I know this isn't true of all of them, but one thing that made me think of was Gösta Brusa's work on Swedish. And what I was wondering was, in his analysis in his dissertation, which I believe was on a 2-peak dialect, although I don't remember what dialect it was, the basic explanation for the distinction between accent 1 and 2, and accent 1 having, the 1 and 2 peak distinction, comes from the interaction of the lexical pitch accent with sentence intonation, like a terminal juncture and sentence accent, such that the 2 peak comes about because of the earlier peaks, such that you can see those 2 peaks happening, where some of the peaks are due to the sentence intonation. And you don't see that in the other case where there's a later peak, and so they kind of get, there's a kind of like a conflation of the peaks. And I guess what I was wondering was, how does that fit into your description in which there really is this one peak, two peak distinction? Or is it just a different dialect that he was working on? Or I just wonder if you could clarify.
Okay, so in this story, in these dialects, the peak, the intonation peak, goes on the last stress. And the last stress in the accent 2 words is the second peak, the second stress in these cases. In accent 1 words, it's the first syllable. And that's why in these dialects, the best way to hear the difference between accent 1 and accent 2 words is to put them in focus, because then you can hear that accent 2 words have this prominence that is on this analysis due to a stress, which is then enhanced by a pitch accent, and furthermore is the site of the sentence intonation. Okay? And whereas the accent 1 words don't have those features. Inside, out of focus, you still get a stress difference and you still get a pitch accent difference, but you don't get this additional enhancement by the sentence stress, by the focus. So it's harder to hear, but you can still see it. If you measure it, it still shows up as a more as a pitch accent difference. And this is, this has been shown already. For example, Selenius did a lot of spectrograms showing that there's a systematic difference in all the positions between accent 1 and accent 2 words. So, I concentrated on cases where it's easy and obvious that there's a difference that anybody can hear.
So in the Jursta Brusa case where the story would be...
In which case?
In the Jursta Brusa, whatever the dialect was and the facts from there, where he analyzed the difference between accent 1 and 2 as being just an alignment difference. So one has an earlier peak alignment and one has a later one, and then all the other, peak is caused by sentential things. Then in that case, though, isn't that there aren't really, two pitch accents in that case because it's just a single peak. It's just a question of alignment.
Okay, so for one peak dialects, you can simply say that, the minimum thing you have to do to characterize these distinctions for any of these dialects is to mark accent 2 words in some special way. One thing you can say is that there's a special star or diacritic on the second syllable that somehow attracts a contour there, which can either be part of the contour that's already assigned to all words, just stretches it a bit further than it goes in accent 1 word, or it can be in the 2-pitch dialects, it can be an extra copy of that same contour, right? So I don't know the details of Bruce's analysis, but it's pretty much based, I believe, on this sort of diacritic analysis, right? And Riad has given some very good arguments for actually analyzing the accent 2 in these dialects by associating an inherent high pitch with the accent 2 words, on top of which then you get the accent, the high pitch that's associated to all the words by a general rule. So that means that accent 2 words get 2 high pitches. But the details of these, the technology of how to deal with these two types of accents is very widely disputed, and there's just no uniform agreement. Well, my contribution is very modest. I just show that there's a system that has never been considered before, in which the two classes of words are actually distinguished not just by pitch accent but by actual stress feature.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this is a really beautiful example of what is a potential sort of typology of enhancement of stress by tone. So, incidentally, for those of you who don't know, Sam Hellmuth has done this work on Cairene Arabic, where she's shown that every single word has a pitch accent in the locus of main stress, as identified in the earlier work that people have drawn on. So that's a language where it doesn't have anything to do with givenness or whatever else. It's a language that just systematically has this pitch accent on that position. And here's a case where it's at the foot level. It's not the word prominence, but it's the foot prominence that is being enhanced. And personally, I think also in English, it's the phrase level pitch accents that we find that appear in intonation. In the default case, these are the same kind of enhancement of a phrasal prominence. But it's very beautiful to see. You didn't give the 9th argument, but you had 8. It's very beautiful to see this. Born out. Well, this is a very nice example of what you would expect if we have this enhancement of stress at all the possible levels. Thank you.
By the way, it probably goes along with some other differences, intonational differences. So it's been noted that old-fashioned southern German, especially Swiss, has multiple pitch accents in places where northern German has just one. So I think this is can be connected with other things. That with Germanic having a rather rich pitch accent system deployed at the post-lexical level. Thank you.